Today we are presenting the roots of Black liberation and resistance in the South. Our goals and agenda. Our goal is to educate ourselves and our global African community on the history of Black liberation and resistance in the Southern United States, and how our fight for autonomy and self-determination are the foundation for building Black cooperatives and economic solidarity. On our agenda, we are going to cover our roots of Black liberation and resistance timeline, where we go over some key events that have happened in our history. We are going to talk about how labor and land exploitation are the basis of oppression and racism in the South, New Africa, and beyond, as well as the roots of our resistance. We will also cover the relationship between Black cooperative development and economic autonomy and self-determination.
Yes, my name is Omar. I'm a member of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. So I wanted to talk briefly about the centrality of Black resistance in the form of pursuing a promised land. That is to say, sovereign land, political independence, or self-governance. I know we've been inundated with a lot of, our movement has been kind of domesticated as a civil rights movement, and not enough has been said to highlight the popularity and the prevalence of a promised land as a form of resistance to white supremacy, to racism, especially considering that this has been the most popular and the most prevalent form of resistance in our political history. So what I would like to do is give a quick overview of important events related to that history, in hopes that it will give a different perspective, a different framework in which we can think about and talk about Black resistance. So I want to first start off with the floating prisons, otherwise known as slave ships. Slave ships were specifically designed to resist African resistance. They were equipped to do such for good reasons. 1 in every 10 slave ships experienced what is known as Black mutiny. And this always involved liberation and landing. They always went hand in hand. Oftentimes they would land on the coast of Africa or in the Caribbean, or sometimes they found their way into North America. And the land and liberation always went hand in hand. Next, I want to talk about Fort Mose, which is a historical site in Florida. It is a Black heritage site, a Black heritage trail. And it started off as a Maroon society where escaped slaves went to Spanish Florida. Why? The Spanish offered freedom. They offered something that was equivalent to the Emancipation Proclamation. Black people heard about it and jumped up on it and went there. That Maroon society soon blossomed into a free settlement that was used in a lot of European conflicts. It had played a significant role. Okay, so next I want to talk about Nova Scotia, another Black Maroon society that was constructed into a Black settlement. It was a product of the American Bourgeois Revolution. 20,000 Blacks joined the British. Why? Not because they were British loyalists, but because the British issued a proclamation of emancipation, similar to the Proclamation of Emancipation of 1863. It was the Lord Dunmore Proclamation, which gave Black people freedom in the form of land if they would join the British Army. Black people jumped on it, 20,000 people joined it. Only 5,000 Black people joined the Continental Army. So here again, land and liberation going hand in hand. These efforts, in a roundabout way, inspired Paul Cuffe, who came in the beginning of the 19th century. He was inspired by Sierra Leone. And by the way, the Blacks who went to Nova Scotia, the land that they were promised didn't come until decades later. Maroons from Jamaica and from Nova Scotia, they settled in what is known today as Sierra Leone. That was a product of Black Maroonage during the American Bourgeois Revolution. So this inspired another Black person named Paul Cuffe, who is the originator of the Black Back to Africa movement. British loyalists incarcerated him for his efforts. He was considered a British loyalist, and he ended up only being able to settle 38 blacks to Sierra Leone. This in turn inspired the American colonialization society, and black people approached this society with a lot of skepticism and suspicion because the society only wanted to liberate or give land to free blacks because they saw free blacks as a threat. But many black people participated in the movement because they had their own alternative reasons and their own cause for doing so. Next, I want to briefly talk about the IMS, which is the immigration movement, which successfully transported 3 ships of African immigrants to Liberia. And all of these efforts, I want to also talk about the Maroonage. Maroonage is only thought to have taken place in the Caribbean, but as I mentioned earlier, it took place in Nova Scotia and different places throughout North America, Florida, Louisiana, North Carolina, Virginia, and even Illinois. Briefly, next, I want to talk about freemen's towns. Freemen's towns were very popular before and after slavery. They were established in over 27 states throughout the United States, most notably Texas. Texas alone has 357 freemen towns. And the most popular freeman town right here in California is Allensworth. I haven't been to Allensworth yet, but I do want to go. It's a great example of a freeman's town in California. Again, the pursuit of land and liberation going hand in hand. Next, I want to briefly talk about the Nigerian exhibition, which was spearheaded by a black leader known as Martin Delany. Martin Delany is considered the godfather or the grandfather of black nationalism. He coined the phrase Africa home for Africans at home and abroad, which, Marcus Garvey kind of stole that some decades later. But he co-authored the North Star with Frederick Douglass. He started many other exhibitions. He is known for saying that black people are a nation within a nation in the United States. Next, we have the Black Exodusters movement. The Black Exodusters movement facilitated the migration of 40 to 50,000 blacks to Kansas in pursuit of land as a form of liberation. They were spearheaded by a brother named, they call him Pap. His name was Benjamin Singleton, but they called him Paps. Shortly after, or some decades after that movement was mitigated or stopped by white people, legislation in Canada, I can't remember, I don't know what level the legislation went to, but legislation was entered into Congress to establish Oklahoma as a black state. At that time, Oklahoma was Indian territory, or at least parts of what is Oklahoma today was Indian territory. So there was legislation actually considered. Paps actually talked to the president at that time, I think President Harrison, about making Oklahoma a black state. Again, this pursuit of land as a form of liberation. Next, very quickly, we have Sherman Special Field Order number 15. Most people know this as 40 Acres and a Mule. This was promised to blacks after the Civil War. The closest thing I think we've ever had to a plebiscite was held sometime shortly after the Civil War. Many black representatives were present with General Sherman, and blacks overwhelmingly decided that they wanted their own land and their own government as a form of payment after the Civil War. This land was supposed to be carried out or facilitated through the Freedmen's Bureau, but it was rejected by, I think, Andrew Jackson at the time, and it never came into fruition, or it finally did, but it was watered down and land was replaced with education. But then again, here we have it again, a case of land being tied up to liberation. And then later on in the early 20th century, we have the Black Back to Africa movement spearheaded by Marcus Garvey, and we kind of really all know about that, the Black Star Line. Again, this was the continuance of a tradition that was over 100 years old, starting with Paul Cuffey. Later on, we see many of these efforts being, I would say, not captured, but going into the CPUSA, being part of the Soviet Union's plan to establish a black homeland in the South called the Black Belt theory. And over time, we see in 1968 the Republic of New Africa started the New African independence movement, and they pursued a land in the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, and South Carolina as a homeland for black people. Again, land and liberation going hand in hand. I think it's important to mention this because these movements, for instance, the Marcus Garvey movement was the largest black mass movement in our history. These are the major movements in our history. The Civil Rights Movement was from 1955 to 1960, circa 1966. This makes up a small part of our history. Most of our forms of resistance, our popular forms of resistance to white supremacy, to racism, have been in the pursuance of land and liberation. So I think we should really consider this when we consider black resistance. Lastly, I want to throw out my opinion. When thinking about the political importance of land and liberation, two things I want to mention in the popular black imagination, the idea of Wakanda, Wakanda and Zamundu. Zamundu from the movie, what movie? Help me out. Coming to America, and Wakanda from the movie Black Panther. These are popular ideas, I think, that caught, this is my opinion, that caught a sort of allegiance and loyalty from black people because there's a deeper history to the connection of land and liberation.
So my name is Sinyaka Bryant. I'm with the Malcolm X grassroots movement. Going to be talking a little bit about how labor and land exploitation are the basis for the oppression of black people and racism in the South and New Africa and beyond. So I want to start at the beginning of this. So at the very beginning of European colonialism in the Americas, it's important to note why they came. You had thousands and thousands of people coming from Europe to a whole other continent, across a whole ocean. Why? Right? It was fundamentally about land, first and foremost. Right? These are people that are coming out of feudalism, they're very recently in their history, right? Coming out of a period where they were tied to land that was owned and controlled by feudal lords. Capitalism was starting to spread and flourish in Europe. There was there was a proletariat being developed in Europe, but the middle classes who fancied themselves as being lords and ladies in their imagination, right? They wanted to come here to this continent to claim land for themselves, and land was the primary incentive. The early colonists, the governors of these original colonies here, had policies in place where they would give, dozens and hundreds of acres per family to people, right, to entice people over to help settle that land. And these are sometimes middle class people from these societies, also criminal elements of these societies too, right? And so they came here to take a share in the conquering of the land. They took a share in the genocide of the native people here in this continent, and it was this thirst for land and what you could do with that land that drove that genocidal urge in those first settlers, right? And because it was because of how these settler colonies were organized, the social formation and the way that even like the national formation of what becomes the United States and other settler colonies in America. But what leads to their formation is a very, very unnatural process, right, in history. The way this settler nation in the United States was developed, right? It developed in a way where there wasn't like an ingrown, naturally developed labor force of their own. Right? They came here, they waged genocide on the natives and then enslaved the natives, right? And then they brought in our ancestors, the Africans, over, right? And when they brought the Africans over, that was a way of importing a labor force, right? Most other countries, that labor force naturally develops. You don't have to import it, right? Here, that was imported, right? So like the development of the class structure here was bourgeois and oppressive from the start, right? Right, and so that's an important piece to realize, right? So you got genocide and enslavement as what characterizes the initial components of the economic development of the United States and the other settler colonies. Right? The stolen labor from the Africans was absolutely fundamental to the development of capitalism as a world system. Having so many millions of people work for generations on end without pay in every economic sector in the society, right? So when we think about the period of our enslavement, we think about the agrarian sector, so like the plantations, the farming, the cotton picking, the sugarcane farms, all of that. That's what we tend to think about. But we also were involved in pretty much every sector of of the labor force. So like the blacksmiths, the shoe cobblers, right? The people that were building the ships, right? Imagine like you're enslaved and you're forced to build the ships to bring more of your people over, right? Right. The cotton industry that was fundamental for the sales, and you think about the ships, all the ships doing international commerce in terms of slave trade itself, but then also the ships that would bring settlers to other countries, right? You think about like the British Navy, right, and all the sails, right? We made those sails, right? Our ancestors made those sails, right? And so our labor power was fundamental and foundational to the global capitalist system, right? While we had our labor power being stolen from us, it's also important to note that the people that they brought over, right, had skills when they came here. Right? So the Africans were, for example, like the rice industry in the United States, mostly centered in South Carolina, right? Down to like the type of rice that it is comes from Africa, but then the labor technique that's used to grow that rice also came from Africa, right? The ironworking and blacksmithing that I mentioned before, if you look at like some of your gates, your wrought iron gates that we still use, a lot of those gates still have like Sankofa symbols and stuff on them to this day, and nobody really recognizes where it comes from, right? But all of those things were skills that we had, and if you think about it, right, you think about like the old. You think about like some of the older colonies, like the Roanoke, I think, colony in Virginia that failed. Right, part of the reason why that colony failed was because those white people that came over didn't know how to take care of themselves. They weren't self-sufficient. They weren't self-sufficient people, right? It was the labor power that they brought in, people that knew how to grow food, people that knew how to build things, people that knew how to organize labor. that's what made these colonies thrive and be, successful business ventures, right? Without our people feeding, clothing, and shelter, literally feeding, clothing, and sheltering these white folks, they would not be able to survive, right? And so that's an important consideration to make, because in some ways it's accurate to say that our people as a nation, right? Nation being defined as a historically constituted, people with shared language, shared culture, shared economic life, and shared relationship to land, right? Our nation, as what we call the New African Nation, had all the skills necessary, like the applied sciences, the labor power, industry, to be self-sufficient. It was the settler nation, so like all these settlers that come in, their shared cultural life, their shared languages, etc., right? Their shared economic life was fundamentally dependent on a parasitic relationship where they're extracting surplus value from our labor. They're extracting immense profits from our labor. That creates a situation where in the United States, even in the early colonial period, right, before it was the United States, right, they had the highest wages under capitalism, because of that that system. When they did, a few of them that did work as wage laborers, they did have like a higher level of pay compared to their counterparts in Europe. And, here, I'm gonna skip forward in time a little bit. And one thing that I wanna highlight here too is that in terms of the history of resistance of the New African Nation in the United States, the vast majority of the slave rebellions, right, especially like the big organized ones, right, had the goal of independent self-governance, right, and controlling some form of land that we could use for ourselves, right? So when you look at the example I like to use a lot is the Second Seminole War, right? The Second Seminole War was primarily a war of Maroons allied with different native nations, primarily the Seminoles and the Muskogees, right, against the United States armies and the settlers that had previously enslaved a lot of the folks, right? And the primary goal of that war, which lasted decades, was one, like the liberation of the Africans from chattel slavery, the defense of the land that had been liberated from the Spaniards, also from the British Empire, and then also from the United States. So like protecting that land base, right, was another goal there, and that that's like one of the biggest examples of what our objectives were during this period. During the Civil War, the Civil War was fundamentally about, from the point of view of our oppressor, right, from the point of view of the settler nation, right, it was about two different sectors of that nation, right? One, the agrarian sector that owned us in chattel slavery, but then the emerging industrial sector in the north that wanted to equally control our labor power, right? But do it in the form of, what's called wage slavery, right? Either way, they wanted our labor power, to be used for their purposes, right? And either way, our people resisted and fought back against all of those attempts, right? And so after the Civil War, like immediately after the Civil War, an example of some of this economic activity and self-determined governance that our people were engaged in is an example of Tunis Campbell, um, who helped to create a government in the Sea Islands off of South Carolina, right? And it was an independent black government. They they took over the lands that had been abandoned by Confederates. They and the land was given to them as part of General Sherman's Special Field Order 15, which is where you get like the 40 acres and a mule, quote that's referenced in reparations conversations from. Right? And so this government organized education for the people, it organized defense for the people, and it organized the local economy, and it was still an agrarian economy, but they were farmers, and they were trying to use that land to sustain themselves as an independent nation. Right. And then, because till this day, they cannot fully be self-reliant economically. To this day, they're dependent on our labor and the labor of all kinds of other oppressed nations around the world. We're not the only ones, but we have like a historic relationship with them that always our very presence here calls the question, like, why are we here? Right, we're here so you can be parasites, right, and profit from our labor power, right? That as far as the system goes, no matter if it's like an agrarian capitalist economy, whether it's this industrialized capitalism, whether it's this this fourth industrial revolution that we're experiencing now. The question of how do we use these black people to profit for ourselves, and how do we stop these black people from doing this stuff, using their labor power, using their art, their genius, their skills for themselves, right? That's a fundamental question in U.S. society that has not been resolved, right, and won't be resolved until we're able to control resources for ourselves and control our own labor power. And one of the ways that we've historically have tried to do this, and this goes all the way back to like the 1700s, right? We used to organize mutual aid societies, right? And then in the 19th century, increasingly organized cooperatives, right? And we use those formations as ways to collectively pool our resources. I mean, some of it started in attempts to buy our family members from slave owners. So a lot of that was organized for that purpose, and then going on in history, it became one of the primary ways our people organized to share our very limited resources, the resources that we did have. We were able to use through these mutual aid societies to do things like pay for funerals, secure buildings for education, start schools for ourselves, and so that sort of activity was a historic threat to these enemies of ours, but then also is something that we've historically relied on and continue to rely on, and is a tool for our liberation. I'll pause there.
Greetings. My name is Kana Azari. I'm with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Oakland chapter. So, what is the relationship between Black cooperative development and economic autonomy and self-determination? We're going to start with the definitions. A Black cooperative is a cooperative that is that's democratically and collectively run and organized as a business or institution, and that is owned and operated by all or a mass majority of Black, African, African descendant, Afro-Indigenous people living all over the planet. That's all to say, we'll find cooperatives in Brazil, we'll find cooperatives in Ghana, in the United States, in the Caribbean, in Afro-Indigenous Asia, in the islands, all over the world, in Europe, all over the world, and also, of course, on the continent, throughout the continent of Africa. Economic autonomy and solidarity. This is the practice of living, working, and trading goods and services in sustainable ways and ways that are self-sufficient. Compassion, bartering, repurposing, interdependence, also known as Ujima, or collective work and responsibility, and cooperative economics, Ujama, are daily practices. Mutual aid, susus, cooperative networks, maroon societies are examples of organizing and institutional models of economic autonomy and solidarity. We believe that all institutions and models should be driven by people's needs and the community's needs and the workers' needs over profit or capital. Not only is it a more sustainable and equitable model, it also carries with it the seeds and fruit of our collective liberation, the living practice and culture of self-governance. Self-governance is a required step towards self-determination, and self-determination is the right of a people to control our own political and economic destiny. Land is the basis. Free the land. What are the opportunities and limitations of Black cooperative development in the South and the diaspora? It's important, before I get into this, to say, while I truly encourage us to move further towards cooperative development, and we need to learn and study the models, we have to understand that it is not the end, but really a pivot towards where we need to go, which is autonomy and self-determination. The opportunities. We have huge populations of unemployed, underemployed, and low-wage workers that have a huge incentive to reclaim our labor and reclaim our energy through cooperation. So because we're the people who aren't working, the people who are first to be fired, the people who have very risky jobs, very dangerous jobs, we have everything to gain from shifting our paradigm and going towards a more cooperative culture. Expand and develop. We have the opportunity to expand and develop a more sustainable and equitable labor culture through co-op culture. And that will move us closer to the praxis of autonomy. So what I mean by co-op culture is there are particular values and ways of being that worker owners as well as community members agree upon. Like I mentioned before, bartering, compassion, letting people maybe create a work trade situation. There are just so many models that are outside of the typical transactions of capitalism, and there are seeds within that I call cooperative culture. And it's that culture that moves us closer and closer towards not being dependent on, as my comrade Sanyaka said before, an exploitive culture, a culture that exists to be parasites to us, that exists to take away our labor. So we have an opportunity to impose and to further develop co-op culture that will shift that paradigm. More land ownership and holdings among concentrated Black people compared to other regions. So the South, what we call the South or Southern states, you know, those that most of us, at least that live here, we have a grandparent, a great grandparent, some aunts, some uncles, some cousins. Most of us have family, right, in the South, right? So this is where our hugest populations of Black people are. Similar to a type of homeland, right? So we talk about New Africa as our indigenous homeland here, and then you talk about where we came from, you know, on the continent. So we have more land holdings in the southern states than any other region in the US. So we have more opportunity there to own and control industry and to own and control trade, and then to decide we're going to create cooperative structures so that it's more sustainable, more equitable. So we have that opportunity because we have the numbers and we have land, more so than in any other place. Some of the challenges and limitations. Capitalist culture and rugged individualism cannot be understated. We've been groomed in it. We're colonized here. Our brothers and sisters all over the world and on the continent have been colonized where they are to believe in capitalism and to believe that it is the only system where goods and labor can be exchanged in some fair way. But when we learn deeper, and as we're teaching today, we know the roots of capitalism is really slavery. And we know that capitalism cannot exist if it doesn't have low wage labor somewhere on the planet. So while it might look really, really nice, you know, to live in one place that has technology or, you know, nice sidewalks or whatever the case may be, it's important to know that under capitalism, it's being paid for by someone living in very lewd conditions to produce some of those goods that are, you know, pristine, or that we think as that way. So that culture and the desire to feed into that culture is something that is a huge limitation for our people, and something that is going to be a challenge for us to move through. Another challenge is the lack of coordinated political activity towards the effort of autonomy, independence, and self-determination. Integration, the idea of the myth of integration, really, I want to say, and the idea that somehow we can incorporate into an inherently oppressive system is still among us. And so we have, you know, our politics that are divided. And so within our cooperatives, this is why we need a cooperative network, so that we can have collective aims. We can use our power towards a collective aim. And the last challenge or limitation is land loss and land grabs. As long as, you know, we've been here and have had land holdings, the settler colonies have attempted to take them back. We talk about gentrification, but before there was gentrification, there were mass land grabs, you know. So this is another limitation as we begin to build out. So thank you for joining us. We hope that we were able to offer you some information that's helpful in understanding where the roots of these economic structures that we're trying to build come from. Where we talk about Black cooperatives, but if it's not rooted in us reclaiming land, us reclaiming our labor, then it has a huge opportunity to potentially be co-opted and unsustainable. So So thank you, and hope to see you on Sunday when we'll be having a deeper conversation and bringing all the groups together to discuss how do we build this cooperative economic solidarity network that's rooted in our collective history, resistance, and our hope for what we want going forward. Thank you.
Now you see, we have a lot of shows. We show you a lot of more shows. We give you a lot of more shows. That's African Star Acrobat. Don't worry. We're coming. We are coming back again. Keep watching. Thank you.
We just watched the African Wonder Acrobats.
And they were amazing. I mean, when I say they can move, I mean they can really move though.
Yeah. Up next, we have our Concern for Community section. Being a cooperative is about reclaiming labor, autonomy, freedom, and space.
Cool. My name is Quentin Sankofa, and I'm one of the collective members of Movement Generation, the Justice and Ecology Project. I have two ways primarily that I serve our people. Through my consulting practice called Serious Creativity, I offer strategic planning, organizational development, meeting facilitation, fundraising training, and other nonprofit development services. I also work as the co-director and collective member of Movement Generation, where we work with activists, community organizers, healers, and grassroots leaders to develop community-based strategies and solutions to the ecological crisis, which some people call climate change. The answer to how I got started, I feel, is two parts. One, I grew up on the east side of Cleveland in a very segregated city. For those who might not know about Cleveland, it's pretty divided east and west. Downtown is the dividing line between white and black. Literally 95% of all black people live on the east side, and the rest of the folks live on the west side. And I grew up there in a very impoverished community. And some of the things that just didn't make sense to me growing up, moving around the town, moving around the city, I noticed that the areas where we lived looked terrible compared to the areas that white people lived. And I couldn't understand this because we were in the same city. And the questions that I was asking, the answers I was given, just continued to confuse me. When I asked about these things, people would say stuff like, it's always been this way. Black people don't want anything better than this. And black people don't know how to take care of stuff. So that's why our neighborhoods look like this. And that never made sense to me for a lot of reasons. Least of which is visiting my grandma and other folks and seeing how much they actually cared for the little bit of the stuff that they had. Going in my grandma's house, you couldn't even come into the living room if you wasn't a certain age. And you had to take off your shoes. It's plastic on the couches, all for protection, right? To take care of the things that they have. So none of these things made sense to me. So I was really confused about the whole situation. I didn't really get any answers to these questions until I got to Michigan State University, where I studied urban and regional planning. It was in these courses that I was able to read for myself how white races systematically created black ghettos through things like redlining, block busting, racial steering, racial zoning, eminent domain, and the field of urban planning. Seeing those words on paper really, really brought it all full circle for me. Number two, while I was at MSU during my senior year, I was able to take a geography course. The geography course began in the summer, in the fall semester in the summer, in August. And I remember the professor began talking about climate, global weather patterns, and climate change. He said that there was a storm brewing in the Caribbean, and that this storm could turn into a devastating hurricane because the waters were warm due to climate change. And he said, if this storm hits the Gulf South, specifically New Orleans, this could cause catastrophic damage. At that point, he had my attention. I had been to New Orleans, I had studied New Orleans, I understood what that city meant and that area means for black liberation. So I was really concerned. And I tuned into the Weather Channel over the weekend, and what I saw is what we know now as Hurricane Katrina. And it was in that moment that I started to begin to realize that if I was going to take serious the liberation of black people, I had to understand more about climate change. I understood in that moment it was not just about polar bears, about melting ice caps, about white people and rainforests. Those things are important, but I now understood how it impacts our community specifically and our movements especially. I still didn't have a place to go and talk about this though. A lot of the organizers on campus, rightfully so, we were fighting big fights around affirmative action, police brutality, and just the general oppression our people face. The people who were in the environmental groups had no racial analysis at all. So I didn't really find a space where I could have both conversations. That was until until about 5 years after Katrina, when I had the privilege to meet my friend Carla from Movement Generation. She invited me to the Justice and Ecology Strategy Retreat, and it was in that space I was able to unpack and think about the connections between justice, ecology, and black liberation. And that's where I kind of started this journey into climate change, cooperative development, and community development.
What is climate change?
Climate change is the warming of our atmosphere, caused by greenhouse gas emissions that come from the burning of fossil fuels like coal, methane gas, and oil. To me, climate change is one of the most observable global consequences of the ecological crisis. It is the literal changing of our climate patterns, too much rain where it's not needed, not enough rain where it's needed. Record-breaking highs, temperatures year after year, coupled with historic drought, causing devastating wildfires. That's climate change to me.
Define ecological sustainability. How does labor fit into this?
To me, ecological sustainability means that we use our ancestral and contemporary knowledge of our ecosystems to ensure that those life-sustaining systems can function well in perpetuity. Human labor is critical to this. We cannot change our condition without changing the purpose of the economy and how we work within the economy. Climate change, as we are experiencing it, can only be caused by human labor that has been enslaved, exploited, and abused. In order to solve the problem, we need human labor to be free, well-resourced, and respected.
How can we co-create and implement sustainable models within our co-ops, collectives, and movement?
The great thing about cooperation is that human beings are biologically wired to cooperate. This is part of why we love doing things together, like dancing, singing, playing, and even working under the right conditions. Unfortunately, by the time we reach adulthood, the capitalist system has corrupted our ways of being, such that we more easily accept dictatorship in the workplace, represented by bosses, supervisors, and managers, rather than through cooperation and democracy, where we practice collective work and responsibility. To make this happen, we have to be very intentional about how we organize and set up our groups, projects, alliances, orgs, services, and businesses. As we go about our work, we must ask at every turn, are we sharing power and decision-making appropriately and equally? Cooperation requires access and inclusivity. If we are going to create co-ops that help us advance the Black liberation movement, we have to reject the isms of racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, colorism, homo, and transphobia. Fortunately, for Black people, we have a long record of movement building in this way. We have to reclaim the best of what our ancestors have taught us and put that together with our knowledge of our current reality. It is essential that we implement, make practical, and actualize our culture of care and cooperation. For example, in December, many of us celebrate the principles of Kwanzaa, like Ujamaa, which means cooperative economics. However, how often do we return to these principles when making hiring decisions or building our business plans? If our liberation movement is going to be successful, it will be because we actualize our cultural principles into all the organizing work that we do. Asante Sana. In my experience working in collectives and cooperatives, I've come to see some interesting patterns around resources and what happens when poor people or Black people have resources. Very interesting things happen personally for us and for the people who are around us. I've come to see people are very uncomfortable with Black people, poor people, and other oppressed people having actual resources. Not just enough to make it, but enough to make it and make it better. Sometimes we stand in our own way because we don't feel confident enough and believe enough in ourselves that we have the ability to manage such large amounts of resources because we've been getting by and trying to make do with a little. But I'm confident we can get over that. What the movement needs is to change the perspective of those around us. When you see us with resources, how does that make you feel? Does that make you feel that something has been taken away from you? Does that make you feel like you can't achieve your goals when others have resources? So I would challenge folks who are not Black when you engage with Black people, make sure that if you can, they're getting the resources necessary. Not just enough, but everything that's needed to complete the project.